Welcome everyone to this first session of the day. Morning, good evening, good night, wherever you guys are. And our first speaker for today, I'm quite excited to introduce her. Reid is a professor of the Department of Ecosystem Science and Sustainability and the director of the Endowed Center for Collaborative Conservation at Colorado State. She's also a faculty member of the graduate degree program in ecology and senior research scientist at the Natural Resource Ecology Lab. She spent 20 years in East Africa and then the International Livestock Research Institute in Nairobi as well. And she's worked in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. She now works with teams to use collaborative action to make progress in complex problems of society and environment in the Western US, Mongolia, and Eastern Africa. I think that's brief enough. I'm sure there's a lot more we could say about her, but I'll just let her do her presentation and then we can have a bit of question and answer. Thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Reid, and take it away.
Thank you, Ritoti. And I most apologize to folks that introduction is a bit old. I'm no longer the director of the Center for Collaborative Conservation, but I am the professor thing. So good morning and good afternoon and good evening and hopefully not good night for many of you. And thank you all for coming. And I also want to thank the organizers. Boy, what a fine conference this is and how well organized it is. And I'm really impressed. And then the amount of writing that's gone on and has been submitted because of this conference is large. But before I get to my talk, I just want to recognize that I'm coming to you from the Coast Salish traditional lands in the northwest of what is now called the United States, whose land and culture my settler colonial culture tried to erase and destroy, resulting in dire impacts on the Coast Salish people. So today, I'm going to talk about using research in partnerships to work on these wicked problems with pastoral peoples in rangelands. And I want to thank the wide range of authors that joined me and that really helped out in creating this paper and presentation. And I've noticed on the participant list that one of the people on the author list is here. So Maria Fernandez-Jimenez is here. And so I want to recognize her key role in this work. And of course, they come from a wide range of different organizations. So we're going to first talk a little bit about what's the problem? Why in the world do we have these partnerships? And then I'll go into some definitions. And then I'm going to talk about 6 cases that really are about these partnerships that address these critical social ecological issues in rangelands. And then we're going to kind of look at the sort of sequence of really outputs, outcomes, impacts, and impact pathways of these partnerships. And then ask the question, really, are these outcomes and impacts transformative or not? And if so, how? So here's the problem. Here we have the loading dock model of science. And we scientists, at least certainly I have done this in the past, take my paper and put it out on the loading dock and say to the public and otherwise, if you can get behind that paywall, go for it. You can have my information. And that may be a thing of the past in many cases, but it is definitely part of the problem. And so when we do that, when we put the paper, just out there on the shelf, then it maintains our power of scientists as experts, and it doesn't allow this integration of knowledges or maybe this generative divergence of knowledge. I'm going to start using that. and it keeps science isolated in an ivory tower. And so that's the very simple version of what the problem is. So, how do we address this recurrent problem and how do we get off the loading dock? So it might be called a science action gap, and it exists when scientists don't pay attention to the real world and real world decisioners don't use science. And I think it's especially true with large scale and complex societal issues. And I've listed many of them that we all work on here. That it's in some ways it's easier to make the connection in the gap because these are so important, but sometimes the complexity hinders us from doing that. So why does the gap exist? Well, high complexity I just talked about, but also this sort of the fact that we've created education systems around the world that compartmentalize knowledge within science into disciplines, and then also the limited collaboration and understanding and communication between decision makers and scientists. And I would speculate that it may also exist because many of the decisions made by decision makers are made to benefit people that hold power, and not all scientific results support those decisions. I think we saw that a bit in the COVID scientific work in the last year. So this is an example of one of the cases that I'm going to talk about today that I was involved with in East Africa. And this is over about a 30-year period, maybe it's 35-year period, how we evolved our model of interaction. We started up there in model 1, and you can see time is the axis on the left-hand figure. And we have this line that says pastoralists, nonprofits and government, and then scientists. And basically model 1, when we started out, we really had no interaction. We just went and collected data and we left. And then we thought, well, let's make sure at least what we produce gets back. So that's model 2, is returning the information. Model 3 is in consulting with what people need to know, but no follow-up. Model 4, we're getting there. We're starting to consult at the beginning and then at the end of the research. And model 5 is this sort of strategic, continual engagement model, and that's the model that we use more or less in much of the work we do. There's actually another model that I'm seeing, which is a little different, is the joining of scientists in something that's already in the practical sphere. So it's sort of yet another evolution maybe of this model. So I'm going to use the word transformation a lot, so I want to make sure to define it. So Walker and Moser the emphasis here is on fundamental change. So transformation is a change process that creates a fundamental change in the purpose, structure, form, or function of our social, economic, and/or ecological systems. And this is different from an adaptation. And an adaptation will bend the purpose or structure of a system, but does not necessarily fundamentally change it. So this is the classic adaptive cycle that many of you either helped create or know about, Holling and Olson. This is from as presented by Biggs. And it's basically getting at the idea that there's this kind of cycle that all systems go through, from being a very conservative and mature system to breaking down and reorganizing and then building up again. And what I want to point out here is there's a box after the 1, preparing for change. There's a kind of a lavender box that says trigger, creating a window of opportunity for change. And so this is, the moment when there's something that goes on, and it's not the research project that creates a trigger, but rather they see that there's an open opportunity. They could trigger, I suppose, but this window of opportunity, at least in my experience, is really key to having knowledge really influence how a system works. Okay, so rangeland transformations, what are they? Well, rangeland transformations can be both deliberate or they can be unintended. They can be positive or negative for the system, depending on your values and worldview. But the main thing is that they all fundamentally change how the rangeland system works. So examples of deliberate transformations are things like a change in land tenure from pastoral commons to either public conservation land or private land initiated by policy. Another one is changes in land use from pastoralism to extractive industries, cropland, ex-urban development, and that's sort of basically changed by policy, but is often, economic growth and population growth is also figures in there, and many other things, or a shift from a state-run economy to a pastoralist economy. Those would be deliberate, driven by sort of a human action, institution, or policy. But unintended transformations can occur, like the tipping points in grassland productivity that many of our state and transition models are talking about due to climate change. And then there can be some profound shifts in pastoralism itself caused by drought and winter storms. One example would be a shift in the kinds of animals that people herd that really have a very big impact on the rangeland. So these are a list of sort of other types of transformations that are not so specific and they're more abstract, but it'll get to some of the things that these partnerships do. So these transformations can transform how we lead, how we learn, the way our institutions work, and how we think about nature and society. They can be creating innovative, adaptive, inclusive, just, and equitable governance approaches, promoting the use of social innovations and social entrepreneurs. And I apologize for all that jargon in the end of that, and I'm not going to explain that. So apologies for that. And then also this idea of a strong respecting and combining different knowledges or creating a generative diversion. See, I've used it twice already. Next. All right. What are these regionalist partnerships? So they're diverse and collaborative and involving participants with really different values, incentives, priorities, knowledges. And so this can be indigenous peoples, ranchers, pastoralists, government managers, conservation practitioners, researchers, the private sector, you name it. It's kind of, depending on the partnership, they'll have different structures. And then they learn together and forge new solutions to problems they identify in particular places. Okay. So how might rangeland partnerships transform rangeland systems? Well, the first thing they do is they transform the participants by reducing polarization and creating this sort of face-to-face democracy. In other words, sitting down with someone that thinks really different than you really changes the way you think about things. And then examples might include, in the US, there have been many examples of aligning rancher and conservation objectives so that ranchers receive new income streams from their land that have to do with conservation, and therefore they can afford to stay in business. And that maintains a pastoral land use and prevents the system from transforming into another land use. So in a way, it's a transformation by maintaining this particular land use, and also livelihoods, of course. Another example is providing educational opportunities to pastoralists so that they become the leaders of their own development and implement their values. This is certainly, and I've put in parentheses the cases I'm going to introduce in a minute, Kenya, Kazakhstan, Afghanistan and Tajikistan and Spain. That was an example there. And then designing and implementing a new policy of land ownership, recognizing the rights of pastoral peoples to own land and wildlife for the first time. And so that's an example from Kenya. All right, so I want to back up for a second and give you sort of maybe a broader picture from my perspective, our perspective of sort of how these types of partnerships are transforming science itself. So from my perspective, and I think my authors share in this to some degree to another. I don't want to have them overrepresented, but I think that we're going through a transition now in applied science that goes from sort of the translational, the transdisciplinary, and then the transformative. You could argue that transformative and transdisciplinary are the same, but I see it moving a little farther than what transdisciplinary is. So under translational science, you might discuss stakeholder problems and incorporate them in the research, and then you do a lot of communications with stakeholders, but also more broadly with the public. Whereas when you're doing transdisciplinary science, next evolution, you might be honoring and incorporating different knowledges. You might drive research questions from stakeholder needs, and you might adopt an adaptive learning cycle with stakeholders. Whereas transformative is more this sort of idea of changing the basic methodologies that we use to decolonize them. It could have a focus on transforming systems, which there's a big movement and a group of scientists that are doing that. So focusing on the goal of these transformative processes, outcomes, and impacts. And then, sort of thinking a lot about developing methods and processes to catalyze system transformation. And then I can kind of see all of that sort of happening. Certainly in our work, we stumbled on most of this. It was just sort of not purposeful. Well, it was purposeful in our approach, but we stumbled on all these other things. So there's going to be a little circle that'll come up, and then the next slide. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, and this is from a paper by Corey Knapp that Maria Fernandez-Jimenez is part of, and several other authors. And this is showing you sort of where all this stuff comes from that creates this sort of either transdisciplinary or transformative science. Then across the bottom is a time scale. And you can see that participatory action research started, oh gosh, in the 40s, maybe even earlier in health and medicine and education and development. But then you can see, gosh, there's a whole bunch of different ways of talking about this. I mean, knowledge to action, knowledge integration, transdisciplinarity, translational science, citizen science. And it's across a whole range of disciplines. And this is really wonderful. I mean, it's just such a area of rapid change of ideas, but it's also really fragmented and hard to like pull together. You know, these people are talking about that over in medicine, and these people are talking about that over in education, and these people in Sci are doing this, you know, and so that's why it's so interesting, is trying to think about trying to conceptually pull some of it together. Okay, so partnerships, transforming how science can do it. So how does it change how science gets done? Well, collaborative partnerships can attempt to transform pastoral systems, but also how scientists work with pastoral peoples. And that's the big point here. They attempt to create science that meets the needs of pastoral peoples. They span boundaries between research and practical action. And scientists often in these partnerships play diverse roles, like the reflective scientist or the facilitator of joint learning processes. And those of you who have done this will be shaking your head, And so what do they produce? I'm actually going to have a long list of what they produce, so I won't go through this list now, but it's quite impressive. Methods. So the methods we used in this paper is we did a literature review of concepts and then all the publications from 6 cases that we looked at. And these, then we did 6 in-depth qualitative interviews and also emails back and forth with the leaders of these major players working on each case. These cases were not designed to be compared with a common model at all. They're, you know, it's after the fact, so there's all kind of problems with that. Thus, we based the analysis on logic and synthesis. The lead author, that would be me, I coarsely coded and subcoded the interviews and created synthesis tables that the co-authors revised. And then the top level codes in those tables arose partially from the literature, co-production literature mostly, and partly inductively from the cases. And our methodology is similar to thematic analysis described by Braun and Clark. So our cases, what do they look like? And what are some of the examples of their process and outcome? Okay, 6 cases, here they are: North America, Asia, Africa, and Europe. So we have one case in Mongolia, and it's a group of herders, nonprofits, governments, and interdisciplinary researchers, which is what the ID means here. And that group was evaluating community-based rangeland management, its effectiveness socially and ecologically. Then in Kenya, we had another partnership that was a student partnership, and community nonprofits involved in the student and looking at the changes in drought and its effect on small stock grazing and livelihoods. In East Africa, we had a large community government nonprofit and scientist partnership developing community-driven actions that promote pastoralism and conservation. In Spain, it was a nonprofit and network, herder and researcher activist partnership to co-create knowledge and increase visibility of women in pastoralism. In Afghanistan and Tajikistan, was a nonprofit pastoralist researcher partnership to co-generate knowledge, creating a useful outcome for communities to secure their livelihoods and food systems. And finally, the US example was government, nonprofit ranchers and researchers, collaboratively learning together and adapting and experimenting with a grazing experiment that ultimately the ranchers saw was going to help pass land on to future generations. Okay, there's our 6. Okay, go ahead. So this is an example from the Afghanistan, Tajikistan in the Pamirs Mountains, led by Qasim Ali Qassam. And this is an example of how they brought knowledge together. So if you look at those sort of, light orange boxes up to the left. This is the indigenous traditional ecological knowledge. And I know that you're probably straining to see this, as am I. And apologies, I couldn't make it any larger. But they went through a process of developing a partnership and jointly developing interviews. And then they were looking at important species and seasonal rounds that the herders made, and also human ecological mapping. That was sort of the information that they were working with. And then the upper right-hand corner, you've got those blue boxes, and these are the climate scientists that are out there looking with their remote sensing at vegetation and phenology, at changes in snow cover and things like that. And so those two sort of sets of knowledge came together into those green boxes. And so they did a lot of ground truthing, but then they were doing things like creating crop phenological models, hybrid maps of seasonal indicators, and community-based phenological mapping and those sorts of things. And they did a bunch of workshops and things like that. And it's much more in detail, I mean, much more involved than I'm saying. So I just want to make that clear. Just going through it quickly. And then finally, the boxes across the bottom are, in this presentation, what we're talking about as outputs. They call them outcomes and impacts, but we call these kinds of things outputs. So this is ecological calendars, high school curricula, a knowledge sharing platform, publications, and conferences. So it gives you a real idea. And this is from the team of Haley Wilmer, Justin Derner, and others, and Maria Fernandez-Minez in Colorado. And these are the ones that were doing this adaptive grazing experiment. And this is their adaptive learning cycle. This is, sort of what they did. So if you start at the top, you can see they assessed the system and the problem, and then they established their goals and objectives, and then they modeled linkages between objectives and actions and selected actions. And so they were really going through this whole process of trying to get to the point of implementing management. And in that section, there's lots of description in their literature of how they changed their mental models, especially the scientists, but also the ranchers, of how they thought the system worked and what was important. And that was and they did a lot of reflective work to try to bring that out so it was very tangible and out and spoken out. And then in the middle, you can see this, it looks like a bunch of flowers, but what it is, what they're trying to get at is that as they were working in different places in their landscape, that there was a path dependency of how that particular part of the landscape would change when they implemented these management practices. So that was a really important thing in what they did as they monitored their outputs. And then as they interpreted data, they encountered disoriented dilemmas. And these are things that are contradictory, and they look like trade-offs and things like that. And so there was just a ton of conversation about, why does this look like it's not going the way we think it's going to go, from an ecological perspective or whatever. And so there were lots of conversation there. And then they would struggle a lot with how complex it was, and then go on and rotate through. And anyway, I think that it was really, really thoughtful process that they went through. So now we're going to shift, and we're going to talk about the theory of change that we came up with in this paper. And it's, it's just based on these only 6 case studies, and interviews and things like that. But I think it's a really interesting set of things. And so if you look on the bottom, you can see this time frame from 1 year to 20 years. And basically what I'm going to talk about in this theory of change is going from sort of what we're calling process outputs and then physical outputs. I don't know if that's the right word, but something like that, and how they come together to become over time, maybe outcomes, and then they maybe become impacts. And so I'm going to define all those words in just a sec so that's clear, but just want you to see that they're arrayed over time and run into each other. So process outputs are what I would call the how products, like co-production of knowledge or empowerment of community voices. And that they're not necessarily fast, actually, but generally in the course of the project, they will occur. Physical outputs are things that are more hand tangible products. So like a conference, a book, or a map, or a set of maps, yeah. And they're produced also relatively quickly in the process. Then if you're lucky, they might lead to outcomes. And so outcomes are like really, really key. So these outcomes are changes in knowledge, skills, attitudes, and relationships that cause changes in the behavior of the partnership's clients or in the state of the environment. So it's really key that sort of, that these outputs connect, and through these things, they change the behavior of partnership clients. That's a really key thing. And then after the outcomes, sometimes there's longer term impacts of the partnership's outcomes on society and the environment. So those are, even longer term, often 15 to 20 years. Okay, so I'm going to start with the process output. So just to give you an idea of the kinds of things that these 6 cases were doing, they all of them convened a diverse collaborative team that built collaborative relationships and trust, all of them. They also, all of them integrated or brought together local, indigenous, and research knowledges to reframe the story of the place, meaning the story of the scientists we're talking about, that the local communities we're talking about, the government people, they were together in a sense, rechanging that so they weren't all these separate stories, and really listening to each other and changing mental models and reframing that story. Okay, and they created co-produced knowledge that is relevant and useful for the community. They socially learn together and solve problems jointly. They built the capacity of all the members. They strengthen researcher action networks. That's more in the case of the Spain case here, but very much so in others. And then also some of them implemented action, particularly that Colorado case, and others created new governance, meaning new institutions, and that would be one of the East Africa case. So what are these physical products? So this is kind of a long list, but a lot of things. All of you that do this work know it means meetings, 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 meetings until you are green in the face. And then participatory field experiments and co-produced research, publications, brochures, films, policy briefs, you name it. Websites, etc. All of those things, conferences, and a knowledge sharing platform, reflective evaluation among team members, particularly good in the Mongolian and the Colorado case, and also the Spain case. And in that effort, feedback workshops to co-interpret joint findings. I think they all did that. Theses and dissertations, etc., and other things and other trainings. Outcome maps to track outcomes and impacts. That was our team in East Africa, and oh gosh, we found that incredibly useful. And then we also did technology transfer of cattle breeds, vaccines, vet drugs, planning tools, and things like that. And a new pastoral policy NGO and then curriculum that comes out of these kinds of products, physical products. Okay, 5 to 10 years. So what could this result in? I mean, it depends. It depends. If you stick around, it might. So, and I just want to say as a sort of backstory a little bit, is that our cases are of different lengths. The student one was about 3 years and the Spain was about 3 years, and the others were a bit longer, and some were really long. So we're sort of all arrayed along this axis of time in our impacts. So these outcomes are stronger leaders that create policy and practice for government and civil society. I would say from my experience, that's almost the most important thing. And then also the community itself, really, and they're part of the leaders, but also community members really using the information that we worked on together, very much so. And then team members implementing learning processes and new mental models, absolutely. And same with the network, it influences policy and practice. Potentially, hasn't yet, but it potentially very much can. And then ranchers implementing practices that better support household economies and rangeland health. That happens to some degree and sometimes not. It depends. They learn new things and they say, gosh, we want to do this. So it depends. Okay. And then the sort of 15 to 20 years on, maybe. So what are these big things that could happen? I think in 2 of our cases, Afghanistan and Tajikistan, so that's one, and then East Africa, and then maybe in Mongolia, we're starting to see this, how important is these confident pastoral leaders when they have a chance to lead government, they have a chance to lead nonprofits nationally, how they have an impact on what goes on and how they really can make things change. And when that happens and there's new policy implemented, then it can really result in healthier pastoral livelihoods and more resilient rangelands. but particularly marginalized pastoral voices are respected and supported. And research action networks can change how science is done, and can also support activism for policy change. And then this fourth one, mental models and transformative learning, it's really super important. It just seems so intangible that it's sort of like, what? But it really is important. And then sort of these norms change, inclusiveness and justice becomes a norm. Pastoralists sit at the tables of power. Science becomes decolonized and democratized. I mean, it takes a long time and it doesn't always happen, but it can. It absolutely can. So, and then new institutions and policy improve pastoral livelihoods and rangeland health. So were these partnerships transformative or, leading transformations, or were they not? And I think system transformation, a fundamental change in the system, is a really tall order. I mean, it's huge. So the answer is no for most of our cases. And it's not because they didn't want to or they didn't try, it's because they just haven't had enough time in some ways. In other words, they're on the pathway to being able to influence and be part of fundamental change. And of course here, attribution is huge. I mean, how much was the partnership responsible for, any kind of change? That's a whole nother question we can discuss. But we can see evidence of transformation in a couple of our cases. And in those cases, both projects help initiate major changes in pastoral, wildlife, and climate change policy, very different policies in different countries that are transforming pastoral land access and ownership, also transforming how pastoralists have influence on policy, and the use of traditional climate knowledge to guide new policy. And then again, I'm beating the same drum. Gosh, both projects focus on training pastoral leaders who are now major national nonprofit and governmental leaders leading system transformations today. And I think that applies. It's starting to apply in our Mongolia case as well. Okay. Oh, good. Yay. No, not just text. All right. Boundary spanning. Okay. So this is sort of an idea of the complexity of what's going on here. And this is really complex. Those of you who do this are just like, are my heroes and heroines that you do this kind of work. If you look at the blue center, here we're talking about how you have to span among different disciplines, not just within, let's say, social science and different social science disciplines, but between social sciences and natural sciences, natural science and physical sciences. So it's really engineering, and things like that. But also you're spanning among institutions, so universities, nonprofits, and you're walking through multiple universities and multiple research cultures. So the level of complexity just in the blue part of the circle is enough to drive anyone really into difficulty, right? And so I think overall, some of the longer term partnerships have been transformative in unexpected and sometimes intangible ways. So for example, certainly with our team, I had no idea how important training of pastoral leaders was going to be. I had no idea. I mean, you feel like it's going to be important, but it is really, really key. And we had no idea about windows of opportunity. So I'm going to get to that in a minute. So key transformations are these changing mental models and building the next generation of transformative leaders. So here's the point, and this is really from Karim Ali Kassam, is serendipity is important. When a partnerships take advantage of new windows of opportunity to change policy or create a new governance institution, it's sort of, there were moments that Karim saw in Afghanistan where he could make a very big impact and bring traditional knowledge about climate into the policy of Afghanistan. In our case, there was a window of opportunity of a change in the constitution where they asked many of the members of our team to be part of the task forces to write the new policy. That's direct, participation and impact. And then finally, these partnerships are changing how we do science and creating new and transformative ways that science and society interact in rangelands. And I'm so glad that Maria is here, because here's some of her. I wanted to end with a quote from Maria because I think it's really great. So the last word, So what she said is, for me, the relationships that are developed through partnerships are a microcosm of the relationships we need to build in our society to overcome the false divides between academic and community member, between environmentalist and livestock producer, etc. Only through engaging with each other as whole people, building empathy, trust, and a shared vision for the future, will we address our environment, livelihood, and social issues. Because I'm an academic, to strengthen the process, I go back to how we train the next generation of researchers, conservationists, and even producers, if they obtain formal education. Collaboration must be part of the curriculum, and co-production should become how we do applied research in natural resources and conservation. And thank you, Maria, for that. All right, I'm done.
So first of all, thank you so much for bringing up, some of these topics that you talk about. And again, I'm quite excited because this is literally what I work with, is the politics of knowledge and kind of boundary spanning, essentially because I started as an ecologist and then I did politics and geography. And so I sort of have that sense that you're just talking about. I had two questions, and again, feel free to answer them at any length that you want. One of the things that I saw that, and again, I'm not trying to call you out on this in any way, but a lot of people have started to use this decolonize word, right? And what does it really mean if everybody's using it? Because then it kind of loses the power that is actually vested in this word. And so one of the things that I saw was, in some of the schematic that you were showing, like the green boxes on that image that you showed, what I noticed was that despite you saying that this was two different kinds of knowledges coming together, the boxes were still skewed towards this, what I call the techno managerial perspective, right? Like, how do we manage land and resources in a way that aids to the development of the state, or aids to this aids to the development of the state or the market, using these tools that are still very rooted in a technical perspective of the world. And so one of the things that, we grapple with a lot, as like I do a lot of this kind of work, which is confronting science on its insidiousness in a lot of these activities, is that decolonization has to begin with an acceptance of the limits of materiality, right? And so what is material is very sort of a colonial point of view in terms of what is important. And so when my question is then that, how do what are the minutiae of doing decolonial work when it comes to addressing these kind of questions? Because at least from what I'm seeing, the kind of examples you've shown me, yes, there is an attempt towards it, but it still seems to be quite hijacked by that triad between state, science, and market. That's question one, sorry. And then my second question is that you talked about process and you talked about outputs, right? But another big issue in the, production of knowledge is this concept of evaluations. Because often we see, if you have these measurement metrics like SDGs or a well-being thing or development indicator sets, they end up marginalizing, things that can't be measured according to, let's say, a quantitative worldview. And so did you encounter, or do you have any views on how can we actually come up with, ways of evaluating that foreground justice, that foreground equity, instead of, using older, or let's say existing ways of measuring that are still kind of biased towards a certain vision of the world? So these are my two questions. Sorry if they're a bit long.
And they're great. They're great questions, and I don't think that I will do them justice, because they're well, I wish I had your training. Let me put it that way, because they're really important questions. So on the can I ask you back a question, that just a point of clarification on your first question? You talked about the minutia of decolonial work.
Yes.
Yeah. So in other words, the details of, what do you mean by that?
Exactly, right. It's because the thing is that the abstraction of something like decolonization, it's sort of like saying, climate change. Well, what does that mean? It's such a big concept. In the everyday daily practice of science, or the practice of, let's say, co-production, what does that entail? Especially when I saw your graphic where there's this issue of, which is the biggest sort of gap right now in any kind of co-production, is analytical justice, right? So you have this empirical justice where many kinds of knowledge are entering a machine, right? But that machine is still analytically rooted in a Cartesian, in a Western science, ideology. And so that's my question, is that, are you fashioning a new machine, or are you just letting many kinds of knowledge enter that same old machine?
Yeah, yeah, and I thought about this a lot as I've sat and discussed and the many of the things that the community researcher team was coming up with, and it really bothered me, particularly the analytical justice piece. I've never articulated that way, but I really like that articulation. But sort of, and also the larger issue that you talk about how it's kind of the machine of science in a way, and you connected technocratic society and things like that. I don't have those words naturally, so I'll just talk science, but that's what I mean. It's the same thing you're talking about. And how we bring those knowledges together and how we truly decolonize. And I guess from my perspective, we're just starting on a little tiny bit of this journey, meaning we're just starting to stumble and do this. And I don't think I think the words you're using and the justice you're talking about, we have to keep in front of us at all times and continually improve how we're doing this. I don't have specific suggestions besides doing a lot of what, let's say, Maria's team was doing in lots and lots of reflection and working on mental models, very much so, and taking it always to the next step, always to the next step, always to the next step. I mean, I don't imagine that we're going to get to a place where we're happy about how this is all coming together for a long time. I mean, maybe it'll be sooner than that, but and I get your point about the boxes and how they were definitely yeah. How as a scientist you go out in the field and you have a set of methodologies that you come with, and you're open-minded and you talk to people about what are the kinds of things they would measure, but then you end up using, okay, for this, let's just use this thing I came up with, and you come in with your education. I mean, that happens all the time. It's a much more simple version of the complexity you're talking about, and so how do we break that down? I think that is a huge challenge. And how can the analytical piece of it really be really decolonize. So I'm not really answering your question. I'm just really saying that. But I do notice that Maria is here, and I have the feeling she has something to say about this. So I'm watching your mute button there, and Maria is a co-author, so I'm putting her into trouble here.
Maria, please feel free to join in.
I think your questions are totally on point, and I appreciate them. I think we all need to be pushed on these things. And, there's it brings to mind the Tuck and Yang paper, decolonization is not a metaphor. And basically that, unless we're talking about giving the land back, we're not really talking about decolonization. So about 2 years ago now, a little under 2 years, Robin and I at the Center for Collaborative Conservation helped to organize with a group of actually some of the other co-authors on that paper a workshop of primarily Indigenous students, scholars, and practitioners, together with a few of us who are from settler colonial backgrounds, to really begin to talk about decolonizing, conservation, collaboration, and the research around that. And that actually had quite a profound effect on me and my subsequent trajectory. And I continue to wrestle with the land question at a very basic and kind of personal level. I think one, in institutions of higher education, I mean, one thing that we can do and we must do is really work on our curriculum. And actually, since that workshop in my department, and I don't claim full responsibility for this, but we've made a lot of progress down to even, creating a new faculty position and hiring a person whose focus is Indigenous rights and reconciliation. So that's a step.
Thank you. No, thanks so much for that clarification and input, Maria. So I'm really sorry. I know this was going towards, and I really want to have this discussion a lot longer with both of you, but I'm noticing that we have 34 seconds left in the room before it shuts us down. May I suggest that, I don't know, maybe Pablo has set something up where we can have this conversation, because I really want to listen to so much more of this. Thank you so much, Robin, again, for that really amazing talk. And the paper looks really great too. I was just reading it, and I hope you can take this work forward, because like you said, this is just the beginning. So thanks a lot for everybody for joining us today for this session, and please stick around.